The wind was already howling when I stepped outside, the kind of Montana winter night where the cold doesn't just hurt, it hunts. Snow tore sideways across the yard, swallowing sound and distance, and that's when I heard it. Wood splitting, metal scraping where it had no business being. I swung my light toward the winter shelter and caught her in the beam, Darla Hensley, the HOA board leader, halfway inside my underground shelter with a crowbar in one hand and her phone in the other, filming like she was on official business. She said she had emergency authority, said she was inspecting my systems for community safety. I didn't argue. I was already clocking what she touched, where she stood, what the camera saw. Inside the house, my daughter Mila was asleep. Her lungs depend on stable heat. One mistake down there could turn this storm into a medical emergency no ambulance would reach in time. When Darla started pulling at insulation and fuel lines, I did the only thing that made sense. I stepped back into the storm and secured the hatch the way it's designed to be secured in high winds. If I didn't, the gusts would have torn it apart completely. That's when she started screaming. Threats. Lawsuits. Authority. I leaned close to the door and spoke calmly. Your authority ends at my property line. But the temperature is dropping fast. Keep the insulation on. Oxygen matters more than titles right now. Then I went inside and called the sheriff to report a trespasser actively sabotaging life support systems during a blizzard. That was the moment everything stopped being noise and started becoming evidence. I didn't end up in Ridgefall Hollow by accident, and I didn't build blind. Long before I poured concrete or ran a single line, I pulled every record tied to that land. Deeds, easements, zoning maps, old filings that predated half the houses in the valley. It was habit from my old life. I'd spent years as a state investigator following paper trails that other people assumed no one would ever read. I learned early that if something mattered, you checked it yourself. I already knew my property wasn't part of the HOA. That wasn't a discovery I made later. It was the starting point. I came here because I needed distance and control. Not privacy for its own sake, but reliability. My daughter Mila has a lung condition that turns instability into danger. Cold air, sudden outages, long response times. City living had already put her in the hospital more than once. I needed a place where I could remove as many variables as possible. Ridgefall Hollow offered that. Brutal winters, yes, but honest ones. Weather doesn't lie. Systems either work or they don't. So I built systems that worked. Every permit was approved, every structure inspected. The underground winter shelter wasn't paranoia, it was redundancy. Stable temperatures, protected fuel lines, controlled airflow. It was life support dressed up as preparedness, and it kept Mila breathing easy when storms knocked everything else offline. For the first year, things were quiet. Neighbors waved. Everyone minded their own business. Then Summit Ridge Estates, HOA, started circulating flyers. They called themselves voluntary. Community-minded, focused on protecting property values. I didn't sign anything, I didn't attend meetings, and I didn't correct them when their first letter showed up in my mailbox, addressed like I belonged to them. That was intentional. Because the moment an organization claims authority it doesn't have, the clock starts ticking, and every letter they send after that becomes a record. When Darla Hensley took over the HOA, the tone shifted. She talked about vision and cohesion like she was designing a resort instead of living in a mountain valley. My property bothered her, not because it was unsafe or illegal, but because it didn't fit her image. Vents instead of trim. Reinforced access instead of decorative sheds. Function over appearance. The notices started coming more frequently. Unauthorized exterior features. Visual disruptions. Emergency compliance warnings. I never responded. I never paid. I never corrected the jurisdiction error. I let her escalate. Each envelope went into a folder. Dates logged. Postmarks photographed. Language highlighted. When fines appeared, I tracked how they were worded. When committees were mentioned, I noted who wasn't named. This wasn't harassment to me. It was documentation. Darla thought she was dealing with a stubborn homeowner who didn't understand the rules. What she didn't realize was that every time she mailed me a threat, she was stepping deeper into a trap she couldn't see. Once Darla realized I wasn't going to respond, the paper started changing. The friendly tone disappeared first, then the explanations. What showed up instead looked heavier, more official, packed with bold headings and legal language meant to intimidate. Emergency amendment notice, community vote certification, immediate enforcement action. They wanted it to feel final. I read every page carefully, not for what it said, but for what it assumed. That's where the cracks showed. Names appeared on voting records that shouldn't have been there. One couple had sold their house and moved out of state 2 years earlier. Another signature belonged to a man who'd passed away the previous winter. One name showed up twice with different spellings but the same handwriting. It wasn't sloppy. It was confident. Whoever forged those votes believed no one would ever slow down enough to check. Along with the notices came references to a group I'd never heard of before, the Aesthetic Compliance Committee. No election records, no charter, no public roster. Just a phrase that appeared whenever Darla needed authority she couldn't otherwise justify. When I asked, politely and in writing, who sat on the committee, the response was a single sentence. Internal governance matter. That word again. Internal. A wall built out of nothing. I decided to stop observing from a distance and show up in person. The meeting wasn't held in a hall or office, just a neighbor's garage cleared enough to fit folding chairs between lawn equipment and storage bins. Darla stood at the front with a clipboard, smiling like she was hosting a neighborhood barbecue. When I introduced myself and asked to speak, she didn't even look surprised. She told me appeals weren't on the agenda. I asked under what authority my property was being cited. She didn't answer that either. Instead, she turned to the room and said my underground shelter was unsettling for community morale. Those were her exact words. Not unsafe, not illegal. Unsettling. Like morale was something fragile that needed protecting from ventilation pipes and reinforced doors. A few people shifted in their seats. No one spoke up. Fear doesn't need agreement. It just needs silence. After that meeting, the tone changed again, faster this time. Sharper. Notices arrived closer together, always timed around weather events. Before a cold snap. Before a heavy snowfall. Pressure applied when stress was already high. It was a tactic I recognized immediately. Overload the target when they're least able to respond. Then I noticed the first physical sign. The lock on my fuel storage didn't sit right. Just a fraction off, but enough to catch my eye. Snow disturbed where there shouldn't have been footprints. I checked the cameras and saw movement late at night. Hood pulled low, steps careful. Someone who knew exactly where not to stand to avoid being fully seen. The next morning, a new violation notice appeared. Issued at a time that matched the footage almost perfectly. That's when it clicked. The notices weren't just harassment. They were cover. Each fine created a paper trail that justified the next intrusion. Each intrusion created evidence for the next fine. A closed loop, feeding itself. I didn't confront her. I didn't warn anyone. I adjusted the cameras instead. Higher angles. Better coverage. Redundant storage. I wanted faces. I wanted timing. I wanted overlap. Winter tightened its grip as all of this unfolded. Nights got longer, colder. The kind of cold that punishes small failures. Every system check mattered more now. Every fuel reading carried weight. And every new notice made my chest tighten, not because of the money, but because of what it signaled. This wasn't about aesthetics. It wasn't even about control anymore. It was about pressure. Coordinated, escalating, designed to force a mistake. They weren't trying to find me into compliance. They were trying to exhaust me until I cracked, left, or slipped at exactly the wrong moment. And that's when I understood something else too. This wasn't just Darla improvising. Someone had shown her how to do this. The storm didn't ease into the valley. It slammed down like a decision that had already been made. Wind howled through the trees hard enough to make the house creak, snow driven sideways so thick it erased the distance between ground and sky. I was in the kitchen running a routine check on the system monitors when I heard a sound that didn't belong to weather. Wood cracking, not the slow pop of frozen boards. A sharp split, followed by metal scraping, deliberate and ugly. I pulled on my coat and stepped outside into white chaos. Visibility was almost nothing, but the sound guided me. My light cut through the snow just long enough to catch movement at the winter shelter. Someone crouched low at the hatch. A crowbar flashed as it bit into the panel. It was Darla. She was half inside the shelter, one knee on the threshold, crowbar jammed into the access seam, phone raised in her other hand, recording. When the beam hit her face, she didn't jump. She didn't freeze. She straightened up like she'd been caught doing something routine. She said she had emergency authority. She shouted it over the wind, waving a stack of papers at me like a badge. Claimed the HOA had expanded its jurisdiction for community safety. Claimed she was authorized to inspect my systems during extreme weather events. I didn't need to touch the papers to know what they were. I recognized names immediately. People who had moved away, a signature I'd already flagged weeks earlier. The same forgery, repackaged. She stepped fully inside the shelter while she talked. That's when it stopped being absurd and became dangerous. The shelter is designed to stay sealed, temperature stable, lines protected. Darla didn't care. She started pulling back insulation, exposing fuel lines never meant to be handled bare-handed, especially not in sub-zero wind. She narrated into her phone, calling out violations, snapping photos, acting like this was an inspection instead of a break-in. I told her to stop. Told her she was risking lives. She didn't even look at me. Inside the house, Mila was asleep. Her breathing depends on those systems holding steady. One compromised line, one seal broken. In a storm like this, that's all it takes. I didn't grab Darla. I didn't yell. I didn't try to argue HOA language with someone holding a crowbar in a blizzard. I stepped back into the storm. The hatch is designed to be secured from the outside in extreme winds. If it isn't sealed properly, the pressure can rip it apart, exposing everything inside. I pulled the latch into place, checked the seal, and locked it the way the system requires during high gusts. My hands were steady. That surprised me. For a moment, Darla didn't realize what had happened. Then she turned and saw the hatch sealed. She started screaming. She pounded on the door, shouting about kidnapping, about lawsuits, about how I'd ruined my life. She said she'd have me arrested. She said she was the authority out here. I crouched by the door just long enough for her to hear me clearly through the insulation. "Your authority ends at my property line," I said calmly. "But the temperature is dropping fast. Keep the insulation on. Oxygen matters more than titles right now." She went quiet after that, not calm, not apologetic, quiet in the way someone gets when they realize shouting isn't changing the math. I walked back to the house and called the sheriff on the landline. Cell service was already gone. I didn't embellish. I didn't editorialize. I reported a trespasser who had forced entry into critical infrastructure during a declared winter storm. I stated that the hatch had been secured to prevent further damage and that a minor with medical needs was present in the home. I requested assistance when conditions allowed. Then I sat down at the table and watched the live camera feed. Darla paced inside the shelter, her breath fogging the air, her phone still clutched in her hand like it might save her. The cameras recorded everything. Audio, time, her words, her actions. Timestamps ticking forward while the storm raged outside. As I watched, something settled into place. I had known from the beginning that Darla didn't have authority over my land. I'd let her believe she did because every notice she sent, every forged boat she waved, every step she took onto my property without permission was another layer of proof. But breaking into the shelter changed the scale. This wasn't administrative overreach anymore. This was trespass, sabotage, reckless endangerment. And if I'd learned anything from my old job, it was this. Once someone crosses that line, they don't get to decide how the story ends. I didn't feel angry sitting there. I felt focused. Because this was no longer about resisting an HOA. It was about documenting a crime in progress, in real time, with nowhere left for it to hide. The storm howled outside, the cameras kept rolling, and for the first time since Darla's name had ever shown up in my mailbox, I knew exactly how this was going to end. She just didn't know it yet. By the time the storm eased enough for daylight to exist again, I was already working, not pacing. Not replaying what happened, working. That moment at the shelter hadn't surprised me. It confirmed something I'd suspected for weeks. Darla didn't act alone, and she wasn't improvising. This had structure, process, money behind it. I spread everything out across the table and built the timeline the way I always had. Notices on the left, weather events on the right. Camera timestamps layered over both. What emerged wasn't chaos. It was rhythm. Citations issued hours after intrusions. Emergency amendments dated just before storms. Pressure applied when response times were longest and scrutiny lowest. Then I started looking closer at the paper itself. The notices weren't printed the way a small HOA would print them. Too uniform, too professional. Same margins, same toner pattern. Same watermark on the lower edge of the page. It led to a name buried in the footer of one citation I'd scanned weeks earlier and never forgotten. North Pine Compliance Services, Circ. North Pine wasn't an enforcement arm of the HOA. It was a private company. And it wasn't neutral. A few hours of digging turned up the ownership, Darla Hensley. Darla's cousin, same last name. Same registered mailing address as one of the HOA's consulting offices. The separation Darla always talked about didn't exist. Once I followed the money, it got worse. Fines paid by homeowners didn't go back into community maintenance. They were rerouted as consulting fees, printing charges, administrative services, all billed at inflated rates and paid directly to North Pine. On paper, it looked like compliance. In reality, it was laundering intimidation into profit. That's when I pulled the development filings. North Pine had a secondary line of business listed under a different classification: development coordination, road access planning, utility easements. The kind of work you do when land acquisition is part of the long game. And suddenly, the road gate made sense. The emergency closure. The pressure to force abandonment during winter. My parcel wasn't inconvenient. It was in the way. My land sat exactly where Summit Ridge needed expanded access to move forward with their next phase. Without it, their plans stalled. With it, everything opened up. They didn't need me to comply. They needed me gone. I knew then why Darla had been willing to escalate so fast, why she'd risked forged boats, why she'd stepped into my shelter herself instead of sending someone else. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was protecting a deal. I made 2 calls that afternoon. The first was to Deputy Lauren Beck. She'd been out to my property enough times to know I didn't exaggerate. I told her I had evidence of trespass, sabotage, and coordinated fraud tied to a private vendor. She came by once the roads cleared, sat at my table, and watched the footage without interrupting. When the North Pine name came up, she paused and asked me to repeat it. That was enough. The second call was quieter. Marcus Hale, an old colleague from my investigator days. He'd moved on to the state attorney general's office, but he still spoke the same language I did. I didn't send him everything at once. I asked him one question instead. If an HOA knowingly asserts authority over land it doesn't control, uses forged votes to justify enforcement, routes fines through a family-owned shell company, and sabotages critical infrastructure to force evacuation during a storm, who handles that? He didn't answer right away. Then he told me to send the files. All of them. By nightfall, the case existed outside my house. Outside the valley. Footage uploaded. Financial trails mapped. Vendor relationships labeled. Proxy signatures flagged. I didn't editorialize. I didn't accuse. I let the data speak the way it always does when it's clean. Darla thought she was dealing with a stubborn homeowner who didn't know when to give in. North Pine thought they were running a quiet operation no one would ever challenge. What neither of them realized was that I'd known from the first notice that they had no authority over my land, and that every letter they sent after that wasn't pressure. It was evidence. By the time the sun went down, the trap was already closed. They just hadn't felt it snap yet. And once an investigation reaches that point, there's no such thing as going back to normal. There's only waiting for the knock. The cold didn't announce itself that night. It settled in quietly, the way the most dangerous things always do. Temperatures dropped fast after sunset, the kind of deep freeze that turns small errors into emergencies. I was finishing a routine system check when the alert chimed, soft, almost polite. The heater status flickered, then went dark. At first, I told myself what anyone out here would. Extreme cold stresses equipment. Lines shrink. Valves stick. That's winter. But when I opened the access panel, the lie fell apart immediately. The gasket hadn't failed. It had been sliced, clean, surgical, no tearing. No wear. Someone had cut it just enough to interrupt fuel flow without causing an obvious leak. That wasn't weather. That was intent. I rerouted the line on instinct, hands moving faster than my thoughts, forcing heat back into the system. Inside the house, Mila had already started coughing, that tight, shallow sound that always hits me straight in the chest. I wrapped her up, got the room warming again, and sat beside her bed until her breathing steadied. I didn't leave. I couldn't. Outside, the wind hammered the walls, and I knew response times would be measured in hours, not minutes. When she finally fell asleep again, I went straight to the footage. The camera showed exactly what I expected, and more than I wanted. A hooded figure moved through the snow earlier that night, head down, steps deliberate, no hesitation. No wandering. They went straight to the fuel tanks like someone following a map. When they turned away, the camera caught a brief flash of metal near the collar. A small pin, reflective enough to glint under infrared. An HOA lapel pin. I rewound it again and again, not because I doubted what I'd seen, but because part of me needed to sit with the reality of it. Someone wearing that pin had been willing to gamble with my daughter's life, not for fines, not for compliance, for something bigger. That's when the other pieces snapped into place. The road gate, the emergency closure, the timing. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was isolation. Sabotage paired with access control. Create a failure, block the exit, let winter do the rest. If we evacuated, the property could be declared abandoned during an emergency. If we didn't, and something went wrong, it would look like an accident. Either way, the land became easier to claim. They weren't trying to scare me. They were trying to remove me. Just before dawn, I checked the cameras again and saw the gate clearly for the first time. Fresh metal. Chains layered tight. Zip ties reinforcing the lock like someone wanted to make a point. A bright sign hung in the center, flapping violently in the wind. Emergency closure. Authorized by Summit Ridge Estates, HOA. A camera mounted nearby watched the road, angled just right, documenting compliance. They had sealed the valley. My hands didn't shake when I logged it. I'd crossed a point where fear helps. I called Deputy Lauren Beck as soon as I could get a signal and told her exactly what had happened. Not emotionally. Precisely. Cut gasket. Video evidence. HOA identifier visible. Road access blocked during a declared storm. Minor with medical dependency present in the home. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she told me to document everything and stay put if I could. Plows were overwhelmed. It would take time. Time was exactly what they'd tried to steal. I walked the perimeter again, moving slowly so I wouldn't wake Mila. Every lock, every panel, every line. Snow swallowed my boots, the cold biting through layers, but my head stayed clear. The gate loomed in the distance, not as a threat anymore, but as proof. Proof they'd coordinated. Proof they'd escalated past intimidation into endangerment. Back inside, I sat at the table and added another entry to the file. Sabotage of critical heating infrastructure. Coordinated access denial. Evidence attached, cross-referenced with development filings and vendor relationships. This was no longer an HOA dispute. It wasn't even a neighbor war. This was an eviction attempt disguised as governance, backed by a development deal that needed my land empty. Winter wasn't the weapon. It was the cover. I sat beside Mila again as the heater hummed back to full strength, counting her breaths, watching the frost creep along the edges of the window. Outside, the storm howled, but it felt different now. Smaller. Manageable. Because once someone shows you how far they're willing to go, the uncertainty disappears. They had played their strongest hand, and in doing so, they'd handed me everything I needed to finish this cleanly, quietly, and permanently. The plows reached Ridgefall Hollow just after noon, long lines of dirty snow curling off their blades as they cleared the last stretch of road. The gate came down first. County workers didn't make a show of it. They cut the chains, clipped the zip ties, and dragged the whole thing into a ditch like it was debris left behind by a storm. Then the cruisers followed, tires crunching over packed ice, lights flashing against white walls of snow. I stepped outside before anyone knocked. Hands visible, calm. Not because I was nervous, but because I wanted everything to be clean from this point forward. They went straight to the shelter. Darla came out wrapped in a thermal blanket, face flushed from cold and fury mixed together. The moment she saw the deputies, she launched into it. Said she'd been kidnapped. Said I'd trapped her underground like some kind of maniac. Said she'd been exercising emergency HOA authority and I'd lost control. Her words tumbled over each other, loud and frantic, like volume might substitute for facts. I didn't interrupt her. I went back inside and carried out the binders. 3 of them. Thick. Labeled. The kind you don't bring unless you're done arguing. I handed them to Deputy Lauren Beck without saying a word. She already knew what they were. She took them, nodded once, and opened the first. The noise shifted almost immediately. One deputy stopped listening to Darla and started reading. Another leaned in. Pages turned slowly. Still images from the cameras. Timestamps aligned to weather alerts. Footage of Darla forcing the shelter hatch with a crowbar. Her voice, clear on audio, narrating violations while standing inside critical infrastructure during a blizzard. Lauren played the next clip. The room went quiet. The screen showed the fuel line. The blade. One clean cut. Then the hooded figure stepping back, turning just enough for the camera to catch the lapel pin glinting under infrared. Darla's face changed as she watched herself on the screen. Not anger. Not outrage. Calculation. Her eyes dropped to the papers still clutched in her hand. North Pine Compliance Services. She tried to fold them. subtle at first, then tighter. Turning the pages over, angling them away like the logo at the bottom might disappear if no one saw it. One of the deputies noticed and gently took the stack from her hands, spreading them out on the hood of the cruiser so the watermark was visible to everyone. That was the moment she stopped talking. Questions followed, but they weren't confrontational. Simple. Direct. Did she have permission to enter the shelter? No. Who authorized the emergency amendment? She said the committee. Who sat on the committee? She named people who weren't present and couldn't be reached. When asked why citation photos were timestamped during an active trespass, she had no answer. Lauren stepped aside and made a call. When she came back, the tone changed again. A judge had been contacted. Based on the footage, the forged documents, and the financial records tied to North Pine, a warrant was approved. Deputies left and returned with boxes. HOA records, vendor contracts, hard drives. Darla watched from the back of a cruiser as her authority was packed up piece by piece. North Pine unraveled just as fast. Shell company. Family-owned. No independent oversight. Proxy votes traced to non-existent homeowners. Committees that existed only on letterhead. Development coordination filings tied directly to my parcel and the blocked access road. By late afternoon, Darla was formally barred from acting on behalf of Summit Ridge Estates HOA pending investigation. No shouting, no threats. Just a quiet, stunned stillness as the reality set in. The laminated signs. The official language. The imagined power. None of it mattered once the facts were laid out in daylight. I stood in the cold, watching the cruisers disappear down the cleared road. There was no sense of triumph, no relief rush. Just a steady calm replacing the pressure that had been sitting on my chest for months, all the fears she tried to manufacture. Every notice meant to make me doubt myself. Every step designed to push me out quietly. Gone. This wasn't about overpowering her. I hadn't beaten her by being louder or meaner or more aggressive. I'd beaten her by letting her document her own crimes. Paper only works when no one reads it closely. And the moment the truth finally gets air, authority built on lies doesn't just weaken. It collapses. The collapse didn't come with a single announcement or a dramatic headline. It unfolded the way real consequences usually do, quietly, methodically, and everywhere at once. Within a week of Darla being barred, Summit Ridge Estates HOA stopped functioning in any meaningful way. Notices vanished. The email inbox went unanswered. The website froze on a maintenance page and never came back. Meetings were canceled without explanation, and then they simply weren't rescheduled. What had once felt loud and omnipresent went strangely silent. North Pine Compliance Services didn't survive the silence. Once the warrant opened their records, the pattern repeated itself across multiple developments. Same notice language. Same printer marks. Same emergency. Authority claims timed around weather events. The state suspended their license first, then revoked it outright. The so-called consulting fees turned out to be nothing more than a pipeline for enforcement money, siphoned off and redistributed through shell accounts. What Darla had sold as governance was exposed as a business model built on intimidation. Audits spread fast after that. Not just in Ridgefall Hollow, but across neighboring valleys and counties. Homeowners who had paid fines for years suddenly realized they'd been coerced by entities with no real authority. Once one group spoke up, others followed. Fear evaporates quickly when people realize they're not alone. That's when the neighbors started coming by. At first it was cautious. A knock. A quick glance over a shoulder. People standing a little too far back, like they weren't sure if it was safe yet. They told stories that matched mine almost exactly. Surprise inspections before storms. Threats framed as concern. Warnings delivered with smiles and consequences attached. One older man admitted he'd signed whatever Darla put in front of him because she'd hinted that emergency services might be delayed if he became difficult. A woman farther up the ridge said she'd stopped questioning fines after Darla suggested her road clearance priority could change. The most important visit came from a former board member. He arrived late in the afternoon, tired and tense, and didn't sit down until I told him to. He admitted Darla had pressured him to approve violations retroactively, that she'd placed stacks of notices in front of him and told him the decisions were already made. His role was just to sign. When he hesitated, she reminded him how expensive legal fights could be and how quickly properties could be reassessed if someone became a problem. He quit when it stopped feeling like community work and started feeling like extortion. The road gate came down by county order, not ceremonially, just efficiently. Chains cut, sign removed. Camera taken down and tossed into a truck bed without comment. Access restored, permanently and officially. Watching that stretch of road open again felt less like victory and more like something being put back where it belonged. The fines against me disappeared in a single filing. Not reduced, not negotiated. Declared invalid. The county issued formal notice confirming what I'd known from the beginning. My property had never fallen under HOA authority. Not before, not during. Not now. The language was dry and unemotional, but it carried weight. It closed the door Darla had tried to force open. Life didn't snap back overnight. Systems stayed reinforced. Cameras stayed up. Locks stayed checked. I didn't tear anything down just because the threat was gone. Trust takes longer to rebuild than walls. Mila noticed the change before I did. She slept through the night without coughing. Her mornings came easier. The tension that had been living in the house with us for months finally started to drain away. Even the valley felt different, like it had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Weeks later, Summit Ridge Estates HOA was officially dissolved. No press release. No apology. Just a filing and silence where authority used to shout. Darla sold her property and left before the investigations finished. I never saw her again. I didn't need to. Neighbors helped each other dig out after the next snowfall. Conversations returned to driveways instead of whispered corners. No one talked about aesthetics anymore. They talked about weather, fuel, and keeping roads clear, practical things. Honest things. The peace that settled over Ridgefall Hollow wasn't loud or triumphant. There were no banners, no speeches, just the steady, earned calm that comes when something predatory is finally removed. Winter still came. It always does, but this time it came without someone trying to weaponize it. And that made all the difference. People still ask me how I stayed calm through all of it. How I didn't panic when the storm hit, when the shelter was breached, when the pressure kept stacking up. The truth is, winter wasn't the hardest part. I know winter. I can prepare for cold. I can plan for storms. What's harder to survive is a system that hides behind titles and paperwork while it quietly feeds on fear. That winter taught me something simple and permanent. Authority without accountability isn't leadership, it's a weapon, and silence is the fuel that keeps it sharp. Darla and North Pine counted on people staying quiet, staying tired, staying unsure of their own footing. They didn't need everyone to believe them. They just needed most people not to question them. Survival isn't only about heat and shelter. It's about refusing to let intimidation make your decisions. It's about protecting the people who depend on you, even when the threat doesn't look like a threat at first. Especially then. Some nights now, I stand by the shelter hatch and listen to the wind move through Ridgefall Hollow. The seal is tight. The systems hum steadily. Inside the house, Mila sleeps peacefully, her breathing slow and easy. No alarms, no coughing, no fear hanging in the air. The storm outside is just weather again, not something anyone can aim or control. The valley is quiet these days, not empty, just calm. The kind of calm that only comes after something wrong has been exposed and removed. Winter didn't almost take us. People did. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?